The year is 1917. The Great War is a ravenous beast consuming a generation, its trenches carved into the face of Europe like weeping scars. In the heart of this global storm, in the quiet, sun-scorched fields of Fatima, Portugal, a different kind of tremor is felt. It does not come from artillery or the cries of men, but from a whisper, a gentle light that pierces the veil between worlds. 3 shepherd children, armed with little more than their faith and their flock, look up to see a lady brighter than the sun, a vision that would soon ignite a spiritual firestorm. This was not a story of generals and kings, but of something far older and more mysterious. A message was about to be delivered, one that would echo through the decades, carrying with it the weight of prophecy and the chilling premonition of a world teetering on the brink of self-destruction. The 20th century was defined by the specter of total war, a narrative written in blood and iron. But what if the most crucial chapter of that story, the final terrifying warning, was not drafted in a military bunker or a high-stakes political summit? What if it was whispered into the ears of children in a forgotten corner of the world? The proposition is unsettling, almost paradoxical. While empires clashed and ideologies battled for supremacy, the fate of humanity was being debated in a realm beyond our comprehension. The message from Fatima suggested that the wars of men were but a symptom of a deeper spiritual malady. It presented a terrifying choice, conversion or annihilation, a choice that haunts us still, its urgency growing with every new headline, every new threat that darkens our horizon. Imagine the silence of that Portuguese field, suddenly broken by a vision that would defy all logic and reason. Now contrast that with the cacophony of our modern age, the constant hum of media, the simulated flashes of nuclear explosions on screens, the tense postures of world leaders locked in a dangerous dance. The connection feels both impossible and undeniable. The story of Fatima is not a relic of a superstitious past. It is a living document, a puzzle whose pieces are scattered across history, from the battlefields of World War II to the geopolitical chessboard of today. The question it forces upon us is as simple as it is terrifying. Were the apparitions a warning for a century now past, or are we the ones living in the shadow of its final unfulfilled prophecy? Portugal in 1917 was a nation adrift in a sea of turmoil. The newly established First Portuguese Republic was aggressively secular, viewing the Catholic Church as an enemy of progress and enlightenment. This anti-clerical hostility created a deeply fractured society, a spiritual vacuum filled with political uncertainty and revolutionary fervor. Beyond its borders, the nation was reluctantly dragged into the meat grinder of the First World War, sending its sons to the blood-soaked trenches of the Western Front. It was a time of profound disorientation, where old certainties were crumbling and the air itself seemed thick with the dust of collapsing empires. In this landscape of earthly chaos, where faith was under siege and hope was a scarce commodity, the heavens, it is said, chose to intervene not in a grand cathedral or a royal court, but in an empty, forgotten field. At the heart of this unfolding drama were 3 improbable messengers. Lucia dos Santos, the eldest at 10, was pragmatic and serious, the designated leader of the small trio. Her younger cousins, Francisco and Jacinta Marto, were 9 and 7. Francisco was quiet and contemplative, more interested in consoling God than in the world's affairs, while his sister Jacinta was sensitive and deeply empathetic, profoundly moved by the visions she witnessed. They were children of the earth, illiterate and unassuming, their days dictated by the slow rhythm of the sun and the needs of their family's flock. They were nobodies in the grand scheme of the world, their existence a mere footnote in the annals of their small village of Aljustrel. This very anonymity is what makes their story so potent. A cosmic secret of immense gravity was entrusted not to the powerful, but to the powerless. It began on a Sunday, the 13th of May. As the children tended their sheep in the natural amphitheater of the Cova da Iria, they were startled by what they thought was lightning in a clear sky. As they sought shelter, they were stopped by a light of blinding intensity, and at its center, standing atop a small holm oak tree, was a lady more brilliant than the sun. Her message was simple yet profound. She asked them to return to that same spot on the 13th of every month for 6 months, and to pray the rosary every day to bring an end to the war. The children, a mixture of terrified and mesmerized, agreed. The encounter was brief, but it left an indelible mark on their souls, setting in motion a chain of events that they could neither comprehend nor control. Their testimony was met not with belief, but with a wall of skepticism and hostility. Their own families were dubious, the local parishioners were scornful, and the parish priest was dismissive. The secular administrator of the region, Artur Santos, saw the affair as a politically dangerous surge of religious superstition. He interrogated the children relentlessly, threatening them with a boiling cauldron of oil if they did not confess their lie. In August, he went so far as to kidnap and imprison them, separating them in an attempt to break their story. Yet through it all they refused to recant. This persecution, intended to extinguish the phenomenon, had the opposite effect. It amplified their story, transforming the children into martyrs and the Kova Dairia into a site of pilgrimage for a growing tide of believers. The apparitions culminated on October 13, 1917. A crowd of some 70,000 people, a sea of believers, skeptics, journalists, and the simply curious, gathered under a sky weeping with incessant rain. At midday, Lucia announced the lady's arrival. What happened next would be seared into the collective memory of a nation. The rain suddenly stopped, the clouds parted, and the sun appeared as a spinning silver disc. It danced in the sky, casting cascades of multicolored light across the landscape and the awestruck faces of the crowd. Then, for 10 terrifying minutes, the sun seemed to detach itself from the heavens, plummeting towards the earth in a zigzag motion, before returning to its place. Witnesses miles away reported the same phenomenon. For the faithful, it was the promised sign, the divine validation. The miracle of the sun had transformed Fatima from a local tale into an undeniable global event. Following the staggering public spectacle of the miracle of the sun, the 3 children became the sole custodians of a secret message, a triptych of prophecies delivered in the July apparition. The weight of this knowledge transformed them. The lady's demeanor during this specific encounter had been different. The gentle radiance was tinged with a profound sadness, a gravity that impressed upon the young seers that what they were about to witness was not a comforting promise, but a glimpse into the abyss. They were no longer just messengers of peace and prayer. They were now bearers of a terrifying truth about sin, punishment, and the precarious destiny of the human race. The secret was a burden that would separate them from the world, binding them forever to the supernatural vision in the Kova Dairia. The first part of the secret was an unspeakable horror, a direct and unfiltered vision of hell. In her memoirs, Lucia would later describe it with chilling clarity: a vast sea of fire beneath the earth, into which were plunged demons and human souls. The souls were like transparent burning embers, black or bronze in color, floating in the conflagration, raised into the air by the flames, and then falling back on every side like sparks in a great fire, without weight or equilibrium. They were amidst shrieks and groans of pain and despair, which horrified the children and made them tremble with fear. It was a sensory and psychological assault, a vision so terrifying that Lucia confessed they would have died of fright had they not been assured by the lady that they would eventually go to heaven. The experience was not a fleeting nightmare. It became the defining reality of their short lives. Francisco, though he could not hear the lady's words, had seen the vision and was forever changed, spending his days in quiet contemplation, wanting only to console our Lord for the sins of the world. Jacinta, deeply affected by the suffering of the souls in the fire, developed an almost obsessive devotion to making sacrifices for the conversion of sinners. For these children, hell was no longer an abstract theological concept taught in catechism. It was a real place, a tangible destination of immense suffering they had witnessed with their own eyes. Their childhood innocence was irrevocably shattered, replaced by a solemn maturity and an urgent sense of spiritual purpose. From this harrowing vision of eternal damnation, the lady transitioned to a worldly punishment, directly linking the spiritual state of humanity to its physical fate. The second secret began with a conditional statement: "You have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart." The message was clear. The wars, the suffering, the chaos that plagued the earth were not random acts of history, but a direct consequence of humanity turning its back on the divine. The fate of nations, it was suggested, was intrinsically tied to the collective spiritual health of its people. The world was on trial, and the verdict depended entirely on its response to this celestial appeal. The prophecy then became terrifyingly specific. If humanity failed to heed the warning and did not cease offending God, a worse war would break out during the pontificate of Pope Pius V. This was not a vague, symbolic premonition. It was a concrete, verifiable prediction, naming a specific historical period. At that moment in 1917, Pius V was still Cardinal Achille Ratti, and the Great War was still raging with no end in sight. The idea of an even worse war seemed almost unimaginable. This detail, seemingly obscure at the time, would later become a critical piece of evidence for the authenticity of the Fatima message, a historical anchor grounding the celestial vision in the brutal reality of the 20th century. To prevent this catastrophe, the lady offered a specific and unusual remedy: the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays of the month. The focus on Russia was startlingly prescient. In the summer of 1917, the Russian Revolution was still unfolding, and the Bolsheviks had not yet seized full power. To the outside world, Russia was a chaotic but distant affair, yet the vision pinpointed it as the epicenter of a future ideological poison that would spread across the globe. This was not a request for generic prayers for peace, but a precise spiritual prescription aimed at a specific geopolitical entity, long before it became the world's other superpower. Should this request be ignored, the consequences would be dire. The lady warned, "If my requests are not heeded, Russia will spread its errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated." This chilling phrase, "various nations will be annihilated," resonated with a terrifying new meaning in the nuclear age that would follow. For decades, these words would be interpreted through the lens of the Cold War, a cosmic struggle between the Christian West and the atheistic communism emanating from the Soviet Union, with the threat of mutual assured destruction hanging over it all. Yet amidst these dire pronouncements of war and annihilation, the second secret concluded with a definitive promise of hope. In the end, the lady assured the children, "My Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and it will be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world." This final sentence offered a crucial counterpoint to the preceding darkness. It suggested that human destiny was not sealed, that the path to destruction could be averted, and that the cosmic battle for the soul of the world would ultimately result in a victory for the forces of heaven. This promise of eventual peace became a beacon for the faithful, a belief that even in the darkest hour, divine intervention was not only possible, but guaranteed. The prophetic nature of Fatima was soon underscored by personal tragedy. As the lady had foretold, both Jacinta and Francisco were not long for this world. They succumbed to the devastating Spanish flu pandemic that swept across Europe in 1918 and 1919. Their peaceful acceptance of their fate, offering their suffering for the conversion of sinners, further cemented their saintly status. Their deaths left Lucia as the sole surviving witness, the lonely guardian of the final, unrevealed part of the secret. She was now the living memory of Fatima, carrying a weight that no one else could fully comprehend. A silence that would last for decades. Lucia, seeking a life of quiet contemplation, entered the convent of the Sisters of St. Dorothy. For years she lived in silence, the secrets locked away in her memory. It was only in 1941, under obedience to the Bishop of Leiria, that she finally committed the first two secrets to paper. The third part of the secret, however, remained elusive. She claimed she was not yet permitted by heaven to reveal it. The contents of that final prophecy became the subject of intense speculation. What could be so much more terrible than the vision of hell and the prediction of a second world war? The mystery of the third secret was born from Lucia's silence. The prophecy of the second secret had contained another testable element, a celestial sign that would herald the beginning of the worse war. The lady had said, "When you see a night illumined by an unknown light, know that this is the great sign given you by God, that he is about to punish the world for its crimes." For 20 years, that part of the prophecy lay dormant. The world, recovering from one war, moved inexorably toward another, seemingly oblivious to the celestial timetable that had been announced in a Portuguese field. The warning was known only to a few, a footnote in a story of Marian apparitions. Then, on the night of January 25, 1938, the skies over the northern hemisphere erupted in a breathtaking display of light. An aurora borealis of unprecedented scale and intensity flared across Europe, visible as far south as Gibraltar and even parts of North Africa. The blood-red glow was so intense that fire departments were called out across the continent, with many believing a colossal fire was raging just over the horizon. From her convent in Tui, Spain, Lucia dos Santos watched the fiery spectacle unfold. She knew instantly what it was. This was the unknown light. This was the sign. The time of punishment was at hand. Her recognition of the sign was chillingly validated by earthly events. Just a few weeks later, in March 1938, Adolf Hitler's Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, the first in a series of aggressive expansions that dismantled the post-World War I order. This act, occurring under the pontificate of Pope Pius V, set Europe on an irreversible path to conflict. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was merely the formal beginning of a war that had been announced by a celestial light a year and a half earlier. The pieces of the prophecy had fallen into place with a terrifying precision that could no longer be ignored or dismissed as coincidence. The fulfillment of the second secret's predictions established the prophetic credibility of Fatima beyond the circle of the devout. It was now a matter of historical record. A war worse than the first had been accurately foretold, along with the specific papacy under which it would begin and the heavenly sign that would precede it. This shocking accuracy created an atmosphere of intense and fearful anticipation regarding the still unrevealed third secret. If the second prophecy was this devastatingly correct, what horrors must the third contain? The sealed envelope in Lucia's possession became one of the most sought-after and feared documents on the planet. In 1944, Lucia, deathly ill with pleurisy, was again commanded by the bishop to write down the final secret, lest it be lost forever. She did so, sealing it in an envelope with the instruction that it was not to be opened until 1960, explaining that it will be clearer then. In 1957, the sealed envelope was transferred to the Vatican's secret archives, a place of myth and legend in its own right. The world now had a date. The countdown to 1960 began, with millions believing they would finally learn the ultimate fate of the world. The anticipation was a mix of fervent hope and apocalyptic dread. The year 1960 arrived, a time of Cold War tension, nuclear proliferation, and global anxiety. The world looked to Rome. Pope John XXIII, who had cultivated an image as a bringer of hope and modernization to the church, broke the seal and read the single page of text. His reaction only deepened the mystery. Visibly distressed by its contents, he reportedly remarked that the prophecy does not concern my pontificate, and against all expectations, decided not to reveal it. He placed the secret back into the archives, plunging it back into darkness. This act of suppression was a bombshell, sparking a firestorm of speculation that would rage for 4 decades. Why would the Pope conceal a message from the Mother of God? The official explanation was that the content could be misinterpreted and cause widespread panic and despair. This, however, was not enough to satisfy a world hungry for answers. Whispers and theories began to circulate. Did the secret predict a specific date for the end of the world? Did it speak of a great apostasy, a loss of faith beginning at the very top of the church? Or did it contain a warning so terrible, a vision of a future so bleak, that the Holy Father felt humanity was not ready to bear it? The Vatican's silence became a canvas onto which people projected their deepest fears. The secret manuscript became a phantom that haunted the Vatican. It was read by Pope Paul VI in 1965, who also chose to keep it under lock and key. The mystique surrounding the small envelope grew with each passing year. A cottage industry of Fatimologists arose, publishing books and newsletters, poring over every word Lucia had ever written, searching for clues. They saw the Vatican's refusal to publish the text as proof of a conspiracy, a sinister cover-up of a truth too devastating to reveal. The third secret was no longer just a prophecy. It was a symbol of institutional secrecy and a focal point for distrust of authority. The narrative took a dramatic turn on May 13, 1981. On the 64th anniversary of the very first Fatima apparition, Pope John Paul II was shot and seriously wounded by an assassin in St. Peter's Square. As he recovered in his hospital bed, the Pope called for the envelope containing the third secret. Reading its contents, he was struck by a profound realization. He saw an unmistakable link between the vision described by Lucia and the attempt on his own life. He believed a motherly hand had guided the bullet's path, sparing his life and fulfilling the prophecy in a way no one had foreseen. This personal connection reignited John Paul II's devotion to the Fatima message. He became convinced that the warnings were more urgent than ever, and that the consecration requested by the Lady had yet to be properly fulfilled. In 1984, in a solemn ceremony in Rome, he consecrated the entire world, with a specific though not explicit mention of Russia, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Many followers of Fatima believed this act finally satisfied the heavenly request, leading directly to the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union a few years later. The world had been pulled back from the brink, but the secret itself, the actual text of the vision, remained locked away. Finally, in the great Jubilee year of 2000, as the world crossed into a new millennium, Pope John Paul II decided the time had come. The Vatican announced it would publish the complete text of the third secret. After decades of speculation, the mystery would be solved. The official interpretation, presented by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, framed the secret not as a prediction of a future material apocalypse, but as a symbolic vision of the Church's past and future suffering throughout the 20th century. It was a prophecy, the Vatican explained, that belonged to the past. The official interpretation directly linked the vision to the great trials of the century that had just closed: the rise of atheistic totalitarian regimes, the persecution of believers, and the martyrdom of the faithful. The central figure of the vision, the bishop dressed in white who is gunned down, was identified primarily with Pope John Paul II and his miraculous survival of the 1981 assassination attempt. It was, in essence, a story about the Church's long and bloody struggle against the forces of evil that had defined the modern era, a struggle from which it had emerged wounded but triumphant. The vision described by Lucia was stark and brutal. The children saw an angel pointing to the earth and crying out, "Penance, penance, penance." Then they saw, in an immense light that is God, a bishop dressed in white, who they had the impression was the Holy Father. He, along with other bishops, priests, and religious and lay people, was ascending a steep mountain, at the top of which was a large, rough-hewn cross. The imagery was that of a great collective pilgrimage, a journey of faith through a landscape of destruction and death. It was a vision not of earthly glory but of profound suffering and sacrifice. The vision reached its violent crescendo as the procession made its way through a large city that was half in ruins, filled with corpses. As the Pope reached the top of the mountain and knelt at the foot of the great cross, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him. Following him, one by one, the other bishops, priests, religious men and women, and various lay people of all different ranks and positions were killed in the same way. It was a harrowing depiction of total persecution, a systematic execution of the Church from its head down to its members. For many who had spent decades imagining nuclear holocausts or cosmic disasters, this interpretation felt deeply anticlimactic. A powerful spiritual metaphor, yes, but not the earth-shattering revelation they had anticipated. This led to immediate and fierce controversy. Vocal critics and traditionalist groups accused the Vatican of a cover-up, insisting that the published text was incomplete. They argued that the vision of the murdered Pope was only one part of the secret, and that a second document, perhaps containing the Virgin Mary's own explanation of the vision's meaning, was still being withheld. The controversy was fueled by apparent inconsistencies. Hadn't Lucia implied the secret concerned a future crisis of faith within the Church itself? Hadn't Cardinal Ratzinger himself, years earlier, spoken of dangers to the faith and the importance of the novissimi, the last things? These questions gave rise to the persistent theory of two texts, the symbolic vision that was released and a second, explanatory text that remained hidden, one that perhaps spoke of apostasy, internal corruption, or a future chastisement so terrible that even in the year 2000, the Vatican dared not reveal it. Lost in the heated debate between the official interpretation and the conspiracy theories, however, was a single terrifying image at the very heart of the vision. It was an element that seemed to defy a purely 20th century symbolic reading, an image that felt raw, immediate, and unnervingly relevant to the anxieties of the new millennium. This single image contained a power and an ambiguity that transcended the narrative of papal assassination attempts and past persecutions, pointing instead toward a threat of a completely different magnitude, a truly global danger. The text reads, "We saw, at the left of Our Lady and a little above, an angel with a flaming sword in his left hand. Flashing, it gave out flames that looked as though they would set the world on fire." Here was the core of the apocalyptic vision so many had expected. Not a symbolic fire of persecution, but a literal fire that threatened to consume the entire planet. A divine or celestial being poised to execute a final fiery judgment upon the world for its sins. The image is one of pure, unadulterated destructive power hanging by a thread. This vision of the angel with the flaming sword is the crucial link. It connects the historical events of 1917 to the most profound existential fear of our own time. The vision continues, but they, the flames, died out in contact with the splendor that Our Lady radiated towards him from her right hand. This suggests the catastrophe is not inevitable. It can be averted by divine intercession, symbolized by the Virgin Mary. Yet, the threat remains. The sword is still there. The fire is still poised to fall. This single powerful image forces the question, was this sword a metaphor for persecution, or was it a prescient vision of the ultimate man-made fire, the blinding flash of nuclear war? The 20th century, with its world wars and Cold War, is now history. Yet the peace granted to the world feels hauntingly fragile, a temporary ceasefire rather than a true resolution. New conflicts fester, old rivalries reignite, and the rhetoric of global annihilation has returned from the dustbin of history to the daily news cycle. We must now ask the most unsettling question of all. What if the Fatima prophecies were not a summary of the past, but a prologue to our present? What if the triumph of the Immaculate Heart and the promised era of peace were not the end of the story, but a conditional outcome that has yet to be secured. As we stand in the 21st century, the words spoken to 3 shepherd children feel less like a historical record and more like a terrifyingly current intelligence briefing. Consider the prophecy's central antagonist. Russia will spread its errors throughout the world. For decades, this was interpreted solely through the lens of Soviet atheistic communism, but with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was assumed that this part of the prophecy was concluded. Yet look at our world now. The errors have perhaps mutated, taking on new forms. Sophisticated disinformation campaigns designed to sow chaos and distrust, cyber warfare that cripples nations without firing a shot, political interference that destabilizes democracies from within, and a new brand of aggressive nationalism that rekindles frozen conflicts. The prophecy's warning about Russia's role on the world stage has acquired a chilling new relevance, its shadow looming larger than it has in decades. And then there are the most dreaded words in the entire Fatima message: various nations will be annihilated. When spoken in 1917, annihilation meant armies, invasions, and occupations. Today, that word has a singular, instantaneous, and ultimate meaning: nuclear war. The prophecy described a potential outcome that the technology of its time could not even conceive of. It foresaw a level of destruction that only the splitting of the atom could unleash. In an age where nuclear treaties are being dismantled, where a new arms race is quietly escalating, and where the casual threat of using tactical nuclear weapons has re-entered military doctrine, this century-old warning sounds less like a prophecy and more like a diagnosis of our present madness. Let us place 2 images side by side. On one hand, the vision described by a child, a celestial being, an angel of God, holding a sword of pure fire, its flashing blade threatening to set the entire world ablaze. On the other hand, an image all too familiar to the modern eye, the blinding white flash of a thermonuclear detonation, the incandescent fireball rising to form a mushroom cloud, a fire that burns with the heat of the sun itself. Are these 2 visions not describing the same unspeakable event? Is the flaming sword not the perfect pre-atomic metaphor for a nuclear explosion, as seen through the uncomprehending eyes of faith? The prophecy may have given us the poetic image, while our science provided the horrifying mechanism. This brings us to the critical turning point, the unresolved loophole in the Fatima saga, the consecration of Russia. According to the message, peace depended upon this specific act, performed by the Pope in union with all the bishops of the world. While Pope John Paul II did perform a solemn consecration of the world in 1984, and many believe it led to the fall of communism, a significant and vocal contingent of the faithful argues that the precise conditions were never met. Russia was not explicitly and unambiguously named as the sole subject of the consecration, as Lucia herself had insisted was required. Was this subtle deviation enough to render the act incomplete in the eyes of heaven? If the consecration was indeed incomplete, the implications are staggering. It would mean that the full promise of Fatima, the triumph and the period of peace, remain suspended. It would suggest that the appeasement of the angel with the flaming sword was only temporary, a momentary stay of execution granted by the splendor of Our Lady, a grace earned by the prayers of the faithful, but not a permanent solution. This interpretation reframes our current geopolitical reality entirely. We are not living in a post-prophetic era. We are living in the tense, silent pause of the prophecy itself, with the angel's sword still raised, its fire still poised to fall, waiting for either our conversion or our final, catastrophic failure. The narrative arc of history suddenly aligns with the prophetic warnings with a terrifying synchronicity. The primary actor, Russia, is once again at the center of global conflict. The predicted outcome, the annihilation of nations, is a daily technological possibility. The central symbolic threat, the angel's flaming sword, mirrors our deepest existential fear of a nuclear holocaust. The Fatima prophecies, once dismissed by skeptics as a relic of a bygone era, now seem to be unfolding in real time. The message delivered in a field of holm oaks was not a closed chapter of history. It is an alarm bell ringing ever more loudly across the decades, warning a deaf world that time is running out. After the deafening climax of clashing armies and fiery swords, what remains is a profound and unsettling silence. The core of the Fatima message, often lost beneath the frantic search for apocalyptic clues, was not the threat itself, but the proposed solution. Before the vision of the murdered pope and the ruined city, the angel with the flaming sword did not just appear. He first cried out in a voice that reached the ends of the earth, repeating a single powerful word: penance, penitence, penitence. This was not a simple call for ritual fasting or rote prayers. It was a desperate plea for a fundamental change in the direction of the human heart. The prophecy was not a spectacle to be passively witnessed, but a diagnosis of a spiritual illness that demanded an immediate and active cure from the patient, all of humanity. What is the nature of this penance? On a global scale, it transcends individual acts of piety and speaks to a collective reordering of our values. It is a turning away from the very sins that manifest as war, the insatiable greed for resources, the lust for power and domination, the tribal hatreds that demonize the other, and the arrogant belief in purely materialistic solutions to spiritual problems. The Fatima message posits that the battlefields of Europe and the geopolitical chessboards of the modern world are merely external theaters for an internal war waged within the soul of mankind. The errors of Russia are ultimately the timeless human errors of division, cruelty, and forgetting our shared humanity. Errors that can infect any nation, any ideology, and any heart. Perhaps then, we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of prophecy. We scrutinize the visions for literal blueprints of the future, treating them like a sealed timetable of events we are powerless to change. But what if the visions of Fatima were not meant to be a forecast of a fixed destiny, but rather a final, desperate warning about the logical destination of our current trajectory? A divine stress test showing us the full horror of the future we are actively creating, in the hopes that the shock itself will force us to swerve. In this light, the secrets are not a judgment that has been passed, but a mirror held up to us, reflecting the monstrous potential that lies dormant within our own choices. Faced with the colossal forces of history and the terrifying inertia of global power struggles, it is easy to succumb to a feeling of utter powerlessness. What can one person do in the face of such overwhelming threats? Yet the entire Fatima narrative begins not with popes or presidents, but with three of the most powerless individuals imaginable, and a call to actions that seem almost laughably small in comparison. The daily rosary, small sacrifices, personal conversion. The message's radical claim is that the immense weight of history can be tipped by the cumulative force of these seemingly insignificant acts of love and faith. The power that holds back the angel's flaming sword is, after all, the splendor of mercy, a quality that does not originate in armies, but in the human heart. So we are left standing at the foot of that great, rough-hewn cross, atop a mountain of our own making, the ruins of our failures all around us. The prophecies have been examined, the historical connections have been made, and the warnings have been laid bare. The final, crucial question, however, is not answered in a sealed Vatican archive or a top-secret military briefing. It is a question that Fatima poses to every single one of us, right here, right now. Were the visions of a century ago a decree, a sealed verdict on our inevitable end, or were they a desperate, last-ditch appeal for us to finally rewrite it? The answer, it seems, does not lie in the heavens, but in our own hands, and in our fragile, fleeting capacity to choose peace over annihilation.